Turn in your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 6 this evening, as we're going to continue in our study of the offerings and kind of going back over some of them with a little bit different focus. As you know, we've seen the 5 Levitical offerings that have been mentioned in the first several chapters of the book here, and the first 3 were free will offerings that could be brought as worship to God. The other 2 dealt with some required offerings that were given that they were to give following a sin that they had committed in ignorance and came to find out about later, or committed trespass either against God or against another person, and the requirements and qualifications for those sacrifices. And so we've covered those 5 sacrifices, and we continue on into chapter 6, and throughout chapter 7 we find some more instructions about these same offerings, but here the focus is more on the ministry of the priests and their responsibilities in carrying out these sacrifices and presenting these offerings before God. And like the general instructions for these offerings, we begin with the burnt offering. So Leviticus chapter 6 verse 8, the Bible says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the burnt offering. It is the burnt offering because of the burning upon the altar all night in the morning unto the morning, and the fire of the altar shall be burning in it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen breeches shall he put upon his flesh, and take up the ashes which the fire hath consumed with the burnt offering on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. And he shall put off his garments, and put on other garments, and carry forth the ashes without the camp unto a clean place. And the fire upon the altar shall be burning in it, it shall not be put out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and lay the burnt offering in order upon it, and he shall burn thereon the fat of the peace offering. The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar, it shall never go out." So, as we begin another section here, we're reminded that these are the things that God has says. I know that oftentimes we call this the law of Moses, but we know that it is the law of God. God delivered it through Moses, and so that's why it has that title oftentimes. But these are the commandments that God has given us, or given His people, the requirements that He gave to the nation of Israel for the worship during that time period that they were under the law. 3 times in this section, God specifies that the fire that burns upon the brazen altar is not to go out, but that it should perpetually burn day and night. And so this was something that was an ongoing thing. The fire wasn't to be put out. It wasn't to be, smothered in order to clean the fire or clean the ashes or anything like that. All the time, the altar was to be have the fire upon it, and so that did make cleaning it maybe a little bit more difficult. But remember, it was a large structure. Okay, the brazen altar was very good size, several cubits in each direction, and so it was large. You could have a portion burning with the other part being clean, so that wasn't a problem. But it was important that it wasn't ever extinguished, and this was accompanying, or this was provided for by the daily offerings that were given. Now, we're talking about the burnt offering here, and that is the first offering that we covered, and this was a free will offering, and so people could bring their burnt offerings, and they would be offered, as we talked about earlier. But this primarily is talking about kind of a subset of that burnt offering, and it's the daily offering that was given, or daily offerings, because there was one in the morning and one in the evening, and they were burnt offerings, and so they were prepared in the same way that the burnt offering was prepared, but they weren't necessarily a personal offering that was given like the other ones were. This was kind of a community or a congregation-wide offering that was presented, and so every morning they would offer a lamb upon the altar as a burnt offering, and they would do the same thing in the evening time. As verse 12 mentions, that there was a specific order in which they were to present this sacrifice upon the altar, the wood and the sacrifice itself, the fat that would go into that sacrifice would be offered. And this was done in order to keep it burning. If you have a large fire, it'll stay smoldering and burning for a long time. When we light the little fire pit that we've got at the house, I always try to keep an eye on it, because all night long it'll smoke and smolder, and into the next day, if you're not careful, or if the wind picks up or something like that, it can catch fire again. And so that wouldn't be too difficult, but in order to maintain the fire in the way that it should be, and make it able throughout the day to offer these offerings that needed to be presented, it was laid in a certain order so that it would continue burning throughout the day, about a 12-hour period from the morning offering to the evening offering, and then the second of the daily offerings would be offered, and that would last through the night. And so day and night the fire would be burning, the altar would remain lit throughout the whole time. Now, offerings weren't presented at night, okay? All the offerings were given during the daytime. But the fire was to be burning the whole time. I read one commentary who suggested that probably some of the priests had the responsibility of staying up and kind of feeding the fire overnight. It seems to me like they ordered the fire itself in such a way, and the fuel for that fire, that it would last without necessarily having to be guarded. But it wouldn't surprise me if, that was somebody's job. Probably the new guy, right? The new priest had to stay up all night and watch the fire. But however that was, God's instruction was that it was continue burning day and night all the time, that it wasn't ever to be put out. Now, this, in part, was in a way to show that the worship of God was continual. Remember, throughout these sacrifices, we've read about how the smoke that ascended up was a sweet-smelling savor to God, right? It was a sweet smell to God. It was a representation of the worship of God's people being lifted up to Him. And so the fact that the fire was always burning upon the altar meant that worship was symbolically always being offered. Now, it doesn't mean there are people there worshiping at midnight or anything like that, but symbolically it showed their worship of God and how He's always worthy of that worship. But not only that, it also illustrates God's acceptance of their worship and of their sacrifice. We'll see later on in chapter 9 that as these things begin to be implemented, because at this point, these are just instructions that are being given, right? Aaron hasn't been anointed yet. That comes here pretty shortly, but that hasn't happened yet. And so these sacrifices haven't been started. They haven't been implemented at this point. Pretty shortly, we're going to see Aaron anointed with oil and into the office of the high priest, and that's when things kind of begin taking shape and being put into practice. And once that happens, this was going to be a continual and ongoing thing. But to start it off, the first fire that was lit upon this altar was actually fire that came from heaven. God rained down fire upon the altar, started the fire Himself. And so another reason that this fire wasn't to be put out is because it was, in essence, God's approval, right? It showed God's approval and His acceptance of these sacrifices. And so they weren't to offer strange fire. It wasn't to be something apart from what God had instructed and even provided for through this process. So it was symbolic of their worship. It's a symbolic of God accepting their worship. And so it was very important for them to maintain that and to make sure that the fire continually burned. Verse 10, the requirements given that the priest who removes the ashes from the altar be clothed in the priestly garments. The removal of the ashes was kind of the completion of the sacrificial process. At the end of the day, actually at the beginning of the next day, they would go in and they would clean out the ashes and things like that. And it specifies that he is to wear those garments because this is part of the priest's duty, part of his responsibility. And so anytime he was serving there on the tabernacle grounds, offering the offerings or going into the tabernacle to offer things on the altar of incense, whatever it was, they were supposed to wear those garments because they were symbolic. They represented this person's standing, as the intercessor, right? As the one who would go before God for the people. And so the removal of ashes was kind of the completion of that process, and so he was instructed to wear the priestly garments then. But then it tells them very specifically to take those garments off before you go outside of the tabernacle area. And that's because they were not allowed to wear the priestly garments outside of that area. Later on, obviously, that would include the temple grounds as opposed to the tabernacle, but the same basic principle there. The reason for that possibly has to do with the idea of the ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness of things, and to have something holy that has been dedicated to God, like the priestly garments, out away from the tabernacle would invite opportunities for it to be defiled in some way, and that was something that they were to be very careful about avoiding, to take the holy things and to defile them or to allow them to come become unclean for some reason was a very severe thing to them. And so that instruction is given. They were to change clothes, and then once the clothes are changed, they're not at the altar now. The pile of ashes is beside the altar. It's probably not like right beside it, probably a fair distance away to the east side. If you remember back in chapter 1, we saw that a little bit whenever the doves, the turtle doves and the pigeons were offered and they were plucked, and it said to put the feathers and things on the east side of the altar where the ashes were. So that's where this is at. Once that was done, they changed their clothes, they put on their regular garments, they go and they gather up the ashes, and then they're to take it outside of the city or outside of the camp and dispose of it in the appointed place. There was a place that was considered holy, or a cleansed place, where these sacrifices would be deposited, these ashes would be deposited. Again, if you remember some of the other offerings that required the burning of the whole carcass of an animal, like the sin offering for the high priest and for the congregation, a portion of it was burned on the brazen altar, but then the remainder of it was taken without the city. This is where that would have taken place as well. And so it would have been a designated area where the priests were to go and to dispose of these ashes and to take care of those other offerings that hadn't been completely burned or had different parts of them that weren't accounted for in the actual sacrificial process. So, next, moving on, that kind of deals with the burnt offering, and again, this is kind of in addition to what we've already studied, and so that whole process is what the priest did, and this just gives some instructions about what to do with the ashes and different aspects like that. The meat offering goes into a little more detail as far as the priest's responsibility, and gives us a little bit more new information regarding what goes on with that offering. Verses 14 and 15 here in chapter 6, the Bible says, and this is the law of the meat offering. The sons of Aaron shall offer it before the Lord, before the altar. And he shall take of it his handful of the flour of the meat offering, and of the oil thereof, and of the frankincense which is upon the meat offering, and shall burn it upon the altar for a sweet savor, even the memorial of it unto the Lord. And so the presentation of this offering is almost identical to what we read about in chapter 2 when it was first mentioned, how the fine flour is to be brought in. Again, that's representative of the fact that it's the best that they had to offer, or the best of its type that was there, since it is representative of the great sacrifice of Christ that he would make. It was to be the best that they had to offer, so it's brought in. It says there that the handful is to be offered up upon the altar along with a portion or a similar portion of the oil, and it's to be burned also with all of the frankincense. And again, the entirety of the frankincense, because that was the best of the offering, right? That was the most expensive portion of the offering, and so it was wholly dedicated to God, much like the fat of the blood sacrifices. The fat was considered the prime part of the animal, and so that was burnt to God, showing that he is worthy of the best, that he deserves the best. And in the same way, the frankincense is given entirely to God, while the flour and the oil is only partially burned as a memorial. Again, it doesn't mean that God isn't worthy of that too, but it does show that he's symbolically receiving the entirety of the offering, and it's all here for God. But it also has a practical application that it's going to be used for. It's not just all going to be burned up. There's a purpose for withholding really the greater portion of it, and that is to take care of the needs of the priests who serve there in the temple or the tabernacle at this point in time. Verses 16 through 18, we find instructions on the permitted use of the remainder of that offering. Verse 16, and the remainder thereof shall Aaron and his sons eat. With the unleavened bread shall it be eaten in the holy place. In the court of the tabernacle of the congregation they shall eat it. It shall not be baked with leaven. I have given it unto them for their portion of my offering made by fire. It is most holy, as is the sin offering and the trespass offering. All the males among the children of Aaron shall eat of it. It shall be a statute forever in your generations concerning the offerings of the Lord made by fire. Every one that toucheth them shall be holy. So Since the primary occupation of the priests was to serve there in the tabernacle, to offer the offerings and to do the other things that were required there, it was fitting for them to be sustained by that labor. This is what they did. It was what we would call probably their job, right? It was what they did with their livelihood or for their livelihood, and so it makes sense that they should receive their wages from that, so to speak. Not only that, later on when Israel conquered the Promised Land, we know that the tribe of Levi did not receive an inheritance like the other tribes did. The other tribes received certain allotments within the land, different areas or regions that were given to them, that their tribe it would be divided into the families and on down to pretty specific groups, but a tribe would have a certain area of land. The Levites did not get an area of land like that. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, God explains it in this way. He says basically that the offerings, what they receive from the offerings is their inheritance, and he actually goes on in verse 2 and says that God is their inheritance, or God is their portion. And so their inheritance was that they would receive of the offerings at the tabernacle, later on the temple, and that would help sustain them as the land would help sustain the other tribes. Not only that, they also had a special relationship with God as being priests, as being his representatives to the people and their representatives to him. They had a special bond, a special relationship with God, and that too was included in their inheritance, the portion that was dealt to them. And so they didn't get the short end of the stick, as some people may look at it, but they had a different portion, a different provision that was made for them as Levites, as the priestly tribe. But God was going to take care of them and provide for them. In this case, the offering there was the flour that was given as the meat offering. It would be made into one of the varieties of bread, but it does specify that it's to remain unleavened bread. Now, we talked a little bit earlier on when we were talking about some of the offerings that could be brought, some of the other free will offerings, that it doesn't mean that the priest never got to have leavened bread, okay? But this particular offering, they were not to add leaven later on. They were to prepare it as it had been brought, as it had been offered to God, and eat it in that way, because again, as it says, this is a most holy thing. And in these areas, the representation that's being made there is important. It matters that these sacrifices were what they should be. It mattered that the lambs brought were without spot and without blemish. And it also mattered that the flour that was brought did not have leaven, because leaven represented that impurity. And so the sacrifice that is impure is not acceptable, because Jesus was pure, Jesus was holy, Jesus was righteous, and if there had been any impurity in him, then his sacrifice would not have been acceptable. And so it matters how these things are taken care of. And so God's very specific and says that this particular flour that is offered for these offerings is not to be combined with leaven, it's not to be changed. They would mix it with the oil, make a dough, and then they were to cook it and eat it that way. Again, pretty specifically, there were some options as far as the preparation, but not as far as what they mix in with it. So it also notes there that it was to be the males, and that's probably just speaking about adult males, because this would be the location where it was on the temple grounds within the court of the tabernacle. It was the place where the priest served. And so what it's talking about there is probably mostly just the priesthood, right? Those who were priests, those who were in that office would partake of this. It wasn't that, all the little kids who were boys or anything like that necessarily got to have a portion of this. It was those who were serving, and probably those who were serving that day and preparing the sacrifices and offering them up to God, because it is a holy thing. It wasn't to leave the premises, it wasn't to leave that area, because it was something that had been brought specifically for this purpose, and so it was to stay there at the tabernacle. Our last section this evening represents the same statement that we started with, or begins with the same statement that we started with, verse 19. It says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying," which this is the third time in this chapter alone that it says it, and there's one more time that we'll talk about next week that it says it. I think that matters, right? It's important that we understand this is God's commandments. These are the things that he required of his people, and certainly as time went forward for the nation of Israel, it wasn't long before they were questioning Moses, right? And it wasn't long before they were murmuring and complaining, before they were wanting to go back to Egypt, before they were wanting to just turn away from God altogether. They needed to be reminded that these are the words of God. This isn't just some ideas that Moses came up with while he was on Mount Sinai. These are the words of God, and so they need to be treated as such and respected in that manner. They do have great authority because they are from the Lord. They're not just the words of man. What he gives here in these instructions is kind of a special case for the meat offering that was to be made by the high priest. Verse 20, this is the offering of Aaron and of his sons, which they shall offer unto the Lord in the day when he is anointed, the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour for a meat offering perpetual, half of it in the morning and half thereof at night. So from the day that Aaron was anointed as the high priest until the end of his service in that office, he was to bring this daily meat offering to God. It says a tenth part of an ephah. In another passage that's called an omer. And the idea there is how much a person could eat in a day. So that's about how much it was. I don't know exactly. I think last couple lessons ago we had that same measurement. And I said it was maybe like half a gallon or something along those lines of fine flour. This was to be brought daily by the high priest. This was, according to tradition, to be done out of his own money or out of his own resources. It wasn't something that was to, we'll just kind of gather it up communally. It was an offering of the high priest given to God, a meat offering that was presented to him each day. It's to be prepared in a particular way, going on in verse 21. In a pan it shall be made with oil, and when it is baked, thou shalt bring it in, and the baked pieces of the meat offering shalt thou offer for a sweet savor unto the Lord. And so the meal would be prepared, it would be baked or cooked. It says there, it says baked. We'd probably call it like cooked on a griddle or something along those lines, a flat plate, something along the lines of a pancake. Although apparently it was pretty thick and tough, so that it didn't run off the sides of the flat plate. But that's how it was to be prepared. It was to be halved. Again, different commentaries have different ideas. Some said it was 6 cakes, or 6 were offered in the morning and 6 at night. Some people said that there were 12 cakes and they cut all the cakes in half and offered half. It doesn't say how he offered, but half of it was offered in the morning, half of it was offered in the evening, and it was entirely to be burnt upon the altar. Again, this is different, kind of a unique thing regarding the meat offering and really any offerings of the priests. Verse 22 and 23 says, and the priest and his sons that is anointed in his stead shall offer it. It is a statute forever unto the Lord, it shall be wholly burnt. For every meat offering for the priest shall be wholly burnt, it shall not be eaten. So, while ordinary meat offerings, remember the memorial portion was offered. They take a handful of the flour and oil and burn that, and then the rest would go to the priests. In this case, the whole meat offering was to be offered. The whole thing was to be burned upon the altar. And if you look at that kind of from a practical sense, it does make sense. If I'm just a common person and I come and I bring my meat offering to God, I'm giving it all up, right? I'm giving it. Now, part of it will be burnt, and then part of it the priest will get, but I lose all of it. I'm bringing that whole offering, and that whole offering goes to God. But if I'm a priest, on the other hand, and all I give is a memorial portion, really all I'm doing is saying, well, here's a tiny little offering, God, and then I get all the rest of it back, right? And that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because ultimately that would be saying, well, the priests really give less than anybody else does. And that certainly isn't fitting, and so it does make a lot of practical sense as far as the representation there, that the whole thing that the priests offer are to be burned as a sacrifice, and as it says there, not only for this particular offering, the meat offering, but for all the offerings that the priests offer. The priests weren't to come in and take their portion of their own offering and go back home. All that they brought would be offered to God, as well it should be. Now I'll finish up by noting that there are some varying opinions on this last portion here. Some say that it was only when on the day that he was anointed. That was the day that this particular meat offering was to be given, once in the evening, once in the morning, once in the evening, and then he was done. Some people say that it was for all the priests. Any priest who was consecrated, who began his duties as a priest, When he first started off, he was responsible for giving this particular offering. The way I read it, especially with the term perpetual being in there, it really, to me, seems like it's a daily thing. And it was practiced that way, at least later on in the history of Israel. We don't have a lot of details about exactly what was done really early on, but we know that later on, at least with the second temple, I believe it is, and past that, the process was done where daily the high priest would offer this offering. And so they're a lot closer and probably have a lot more experience. I'm not saying that everything that they did was right, but they probably had a good understanding of what was expected as far as especially the ceremony that was associated with the worship of God in those times. So I think it was for the high priest, and that daily he would offer this meat offering both in the morning and in the evening as a symbol of his dedication to God and God's provision. Next week, we'll continue on looking at some of these requirements for the priesthood pertaining to these different Levitical offerings. We've covered a couple, and we'll try to get the other ones in next week. So, any questions or comments on any of that?